I would say a lot of exotic cars, jewelry that I did. I had a car fetish when I was very young. I had 5 or 6 different cars, but I had the most expensive cars.
Antoine Walker blew his fortune on luxury cars and flashy jewelry, but his downfall wasn't even the worst. Latrell Spruel rejected a $21 million contract and still went broke. And Dennis Rodman, he lost everything to legal battles. In this video, we're looking at NBA legends who went from having it all to being completely penniless. Let's start with Allen Iverson. Allen Iverson wasn't just a basketball player, he was a cultural phenomenon who revolutionized the game with his lightning-fast crossover, fearless drives to the basket, and an attitude that screamed authenticity in an era of manufactured personas. Standing at just 6 feet tall, Iverson proved that heart could triumph over height, becoming an 11-time All-Star and eventually earning his place in the Basketball Hall of Fame. During his illustrious career, Allen Iverson accumulated approximately $200 million in career earnings, a fortune that seemed insurmountable for someone who grew up in the housing projects of Hampton, Virginia. The seeds of Iverson's financial downfall were planted in his approach to wealth. Rather than viewing his earnings as a finite resource that needed careful management, Iverson treated his money like the basketball court, a place where he could do whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. Iverson's entourage became a financial black hole that consumed money at an alarming rate. He maintained a massive crew of friends, family members, and hangers-on, all of whom enjoyed the benefits of his success. Private jets, luxury hotel suites, expensive dinners, and extravagant shopping sprees became routine expenses. But perhaps even more concerning was his obsession with jewelry and luxury vehicles, purchases that depreciated rapidly while draining his bank account. The jewelry alone represented a staggering financial commitment. Iverson's collection included diamond-encrusted chains, watches worth more than most people's homes, and custom pieces that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. His unpaid bills to jewelers eventually became so significant that they contributed to his path toward bankruptcy, representing not just poor financial planning, but a fundamental misunderstanding of how wealth should be managed. The situation became so dire that Iverson, despite his massive career earnings, found himself facing the very real possibility of complete financial ruin. The man who had once been the answer to Philadelphia's basketball prayers was now searching for answers to his own financial crisis. However, Iverson's story doesn't end in complete disaster. His salvation came in the form of a lifetime endorsement deal with Reebok that proved to be more valuable than anyone initially realized. This deal, negotiated during his playing career, included provisions that would continue paying him well into his retirement. Reebok eventually made him their vice president of basketball, providing both income and a platform for him to remain connected to the sport he loved. While Iverson's downfall came from excessive spending on luxury and his entourage, the next player lost it all to a gambling addiction: Antoine Walker. Antoine Walker's basketball career was marked by versatility, 3 All-Star appearances, and the ultimate prize, an NBA championship. But Walker's life away from the basketball court told a different story entirely, one that would ultimately overshadow his athletic achievements and serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of gambling addiction and unchecked spending. Antoine Walker's career earnings totaled an impressive $108 million, a sum that should have set him up for multiple lifetimes of financial security. But Walker approached his wealth with the same aggressive mentality he brought to the basketball court, making high-stakes decisions that would ultimately cost him everything he had worked so hard to achieve. The foundation of Walker's financial problems lay in his extravagant lifestyle choices. He didn't just buy expensive items, he collected them like trophies. Luxury homes in multiple cities, each furnished with the finest appointments money could buy. A fleet of exotic cars that would make a luxury dealership envious. Designer clothing, expensive watches, and all the trappings of a lifestyle that burned through money at an astronomical rate. But if Walker's spending on material possessions was concerning, his gambling addiction was absolutely devastating. Walker didn't just enjoy a lavish trip to Las Vegas. He developed a compulsive gambling habit that consumed not just his money, but his time, his relationships, and ultimately his financial future. The thrill of high-stakes gambling became an addiction that proved impossible to control. Walker's gambling debts eventually reached over $770,000 owed to casinos, representing just the tip of the iceberg when it came to his financial obligations. The casinos, which had initially welcomed him as a high-rolling celebrity customer, eventually became creditors pursuing legal action to recover their losses. The situation reached its inevitable conclusion in 2010 when Walker was forced to file for bankruptcy, a legal acknowledgement that his liabilities far exceeded his assets. The man who had once been worth over $100 million found himself unable to pay his debts, facing the kind of financial scrutiny that accompanies bankruptcy proceedings. However, Walker's post-bankruptcy life has been marked by redemption and a desire to help others avoid the mistakes he made. Understanding the importance of financial education for athletes, Walker now works as a sports analyst and financial consultant for athletes, using his experience as a cautionary tale to help current players make better financial decisions. However, while Walker's gambling addiction was ultimately conquered through intervention and education, our next player's story shows how pride and overconfidence can be equally destructive, especially when a single decision can alter the trajectory of an entire financial future. Latrell Spruel. Latrell Spruel's basketball career was defined by intensity, skill, and controversy in equal measure. A four-time All-Star known for his tenacious defense and clutch shooting, Spruel seemed to have everything going for him. But one decision, a decision that seemed logical at the time, would set in motion a chain of events that would lead to his financial ruin. Spruel's career earnings reached approximately $100 million, accumulated through years of high-level NBA performance. But in 2005, Spruel made a decision that would haunt him for years to come. When the Minnesota Timberwolves offered him a 3-year, $21 million contract extension, Spruel famously rejected it, stating that he had a family to feed and that the offer wasn't sufficient for his needs. The rejection of that contract offer wasn't just a negotiating tactic. It was a fundamental miscalculation about his value in the marketplace and his future earning potential. Spruel believed that he could secure a more lucrative deal elsewhere, but the NBA landscape was changing, and teams were becoming more cautious about long-term commitments to aging players. What followed was a financial nightmare that unfolded slowly but relentlessly. Spruel faced asset sales, back taxes, and a $200 million lawsuit from his ex-wife, creating a perfect storm of financial obligations that far exceeded his remaining resources. The back taxes represented another layer of financial irresponsibility. Like many athletes who come into sudden wealth, Spruel apparently failed to properly plan for his tax obligations, allowing debt to accumulate with the IRS, one of the most dangerous creditors to ignore. But perhaps most devastating was the lawsuit from his ex-wife, which sought $200 million in damages. Whether or not the lawsuit was successful, the legal fees alone would have been astronomical, and the stress of such proceedings would have made it difficult for Spruel to focus on rebuilding his financial situation. The combination of these factors led to what can only be described as complete financial ruin. The man who had once turned down $21 million found himself unable to pay his basic obligations, facing the kind of financial pressure that would break most people. However, Spruel's story doesn't end in complete disaster. He currently works as a media personality for Madison Square Garden, a position that provides both income and allows him to remain connected to the basketball world that made him famous. While this work likely doesn't provide the kind of income he once enjoyed as a player, it represents stability and a chance to rebuild his financial life. Where Spruel's downfall was largely self-inflicted through poor decision-making and ego, our next story takes us into darker territory, exploring how personal demons and addiction can destroy not just wealth, but nearly everything that matters in life. Vin Baker. Vin Baker's story is perhaps the most dramatic roller coaster ride among all the tales we're exploring today. A four-time All-Star who seemed to have everything going for him, Baker's fall from grace was as spectacular as his eventual redemption, taking him from the heights of NBA stardom to working at Starbucks and ultimately to contributing to an NBA championship team. Baker's career earnings reached approximately $100 million, accumulated during a successful NBA career that saw him establish himself as one of the league's premier power forwards. But Baker's greatest opponent wasn't found on any basketball court. It was found in the mirror as he battled substance abuse issues that would ultimately cost him his fortune and nearly his life. Substance abuse, bad relationships, and failed investments drained his fortune, creating a trifecta of financial destruction that proved impossible to overcome. The failed investments were particularly painful. When someone is dealing with addiction, they become vulnerable to bad advice and poor decision-making, making them easy targets for unscrupulous individuals looking to separate them from their money. The situation became so dire that Baker, a man who had once earned millions of dollars playing basketball, was forced to work at Starbucks temporarily to make ends meet. The image of a former NBA All-Star working behind a coffee counter serves as one of the most powerful illustrations of how far someone can fall when addiction takes control of their life. But Baker's story doesn't end at the coffee shop. His journey toward redemption began with addressing his addiction issues and rebuilding his life one day at a time. Recovery from addiction is never easy, but Baker demonstrated the same determination that made him successful on the basketball court. The true measure of Baker's redemption came when he rebounded as an assistant coach for the Milwaukee Bucks, helping them win the 2021 NBA title. Unlike Baker's battle with internal demons, our next player's financial struggles were largely driven by external obligations and life choices that created mounting pressures from multiple directions. Shaun Kemp. Shaun Kemp was basketball poetry in motion. Known as the Rain Man, his thunderous dunks and athletic prowess made him one of the most exciting players of the 1990s, earning him 6 All-Star selections and a place in basketball history. But Kemp's life away from the court was complicated by personal decisions that would ultimately drain his substantial wealth and create ongoing financial obligations that persist to this day. Kemp's career earnings totaled approximately $90 million, a fortune accumulated during an era when NBA salaries were rapidly increasing. But Kemp's approach to his personal life created financial obligations that would prove difficult to manage, regardless of his earning potential. The primary source of Kemp's financial difficulties stemmed from child support obligations for multiple families. While the exact number of children has been the subject of media speculation over the years, it's clear that Kemp's child support obligations represented a significant monthly expense that continued long after his playing career ended. Child support calculations for high-earning individuals like professional athletes are typically based on their peak earning years, meaning that even after retirement, former players can face monthly obligations that reflect their former income levels rather than their current financial situation. For Kemp, this meant that his child support obligations remained high, even as his earning potential decreased. Adding to his financial burden were legal fees from drug possession charges, which not only cost money in legal representation, but also limited his earning potential through endorsements and other business opportunities. Legal troubles can be particularly damaging for former athletes, as they often rely on their public image to generate income through appearances, endorsements, and business ventures. The combination of high child support obligations and legal fees created a financial situation that would have been challenging for anyone to manage, but was particularly difficult for someone whose earning potential was largely tied to their athletic performance and public image. The cannabis industry has provided opportunities for many former athletes to rebuild their financial lives, and Kemp's involvement represents a practical approach to generating income while working within the legal framework of states where cannabis has been legalized. While Kemp's financial troubles stem primarily from personal relationships and legal issues, our next player's downfall demonstrates how broader economic forces can devastate even the most carefully planned investments, proving that sometimes external circumstances can be just as dangerous as personal mistakes. Derrick Coleman. Derrick Coleman's basketball career began with tremendous promise. The first overall pick in the 1990 NBA draft, Coleman was named Rookie of the Year and went on to earn All-Star recognition. But Coleman's financial story became intertwined with broader economic forces that were beyond his control, demonstrating how even wealthy individuals can be vulnerable to economic downturns. Derrick Coleman's career earnings reached approximately $87 million, accumulated during a solid NBA career that established him as one of the league's skilled big men. But Coleman's post-career financial strategy proved to be vulnerable to economic forces that would ultimately wipe out his wealth. Like many wealthy individuals, Coleman had invested heavily in real estate and other ventures, particularly in the Detroit area. An extravagant lifestyle, heavy partying, and failed investments during the 2010 economic crisis in Detroit wiped out his wealth, creating a perfect storm of financial destruction. The 2010 economic crisis hit Detroit particularly hard, as the city was already struggling with the decline of the automotive industry and other economic challenges. Real estate values plummeted, businesses failed, and investments that had seemed solid suddenly became worthless. For Coleman, who had tied much of his wealth to the Detroit economy, this represented a devastating blow. The extravagant lifestyle and heavy partying mentioned in the research suggest that Coleman was also spending money at an unsustainable rate, making him particularly vulnerable when his investments began to fail. When your expenses are high and your income sources are threatened, financial ruin can happen quickly. But Coleman's response to his financial setback demonstrates resilience and a commitment to making a positive impact. He later earned a college degree and runs community programs focused on clean water and basketball, showing that he used his experience to refocus his priorities and find meaningful ways to contribute to his community. While Coleman's financial troubles were largely tied to external economic circumstances, our next player's struggles were almost entirely self-inflicted, a pattern of poor decisions and lavish spending that created insurmountable financial obligations. Larry Johnson. Larry Johnson was one of the most dominant power forwards of his era, earning 2 All-Star selections and becoming one of the most recognizable players in the NBA through his memorable Grandmama commercials. But Johnson's financial story is marked by the kind of personal decisions that can drain even the most substantial wealth over time. Larry Johnson's career earnings totaled approximately $83 million, accumulated during a successful NBA career that was cut short by back injuries, but nonetheless provided him with significant financial resources. However, Johnson Johnson's approach to his personal life created ongoing financial obligations that would ultimately lead to his downfall. The research indicates that Johnson was squandering money on a lavish lifestyle, which likely included the typical trappings of wealth that many athletes struggle to manage responsibly. Expensive cars, luxury homes, designer clothing, and entertainment expenses can quickly add up, especially when there's no clear budget or financial planning in place. But perhaps more significantly, Johnson found himself owing $120,000 in child support for 5 children with 4 women, creating ongoing financial obligations that would continue long after his playing career ended. Child support obligations can be particularly challenging for former athletes, as they're often calculated based on peak earning years but continue even when income decreases. The combination of lavish spending and substantial child support obligations created a financial situation that pushed him into bankruptcy, forcing him to confront the reality that his spending had far exceeded his resources. What makes Johnson's story particularly concerning is that recent reports mention legal troubles, suggesting that his financial problems may have continued or evolved into other issues. The research notes that his current ventures aren't detailed, which could indicate that he hasn't found stable sources of income to replace his playing career earnings. Where Johnson's story represents ongoing struggles with limited recovery, our next player's tale shows how even solid careers and substantial earnings can lead to financial difficulties when investment strategies fail to match personal obligations. Glenn Rice. Glenn Rice was one of the most skilled shooters in NBA history, earning 3 All-Star selections and establishing himself as one of the most reliable scorers of his era. But Rice's financial story demonstrates how even players with solid careers and substantial earnings can find themselves struggling when their planning doesn't match their obligations. Rice's career earnings reached approximately $67 million, accumulated during a successful NBA career that saw him establish himself as one of the league's premier three-point shooters. But Rice's post-career financial situation was compromised by investment decisions and personal obligations that proved difficult to manage. The research indicates that failed investments and struggles with child support left him relying on autograph signings for income, painting a picture of a former star who was forced to capitalize on his past fame to generate current income. Autograph signings, while a legitimate source of income for former athletes, typically provide relatively modest compensation compared to the salaries these players once earned. Failed investments are a common theme among the players we're discussing today, and Rice's experience illustrates how former athletes can be particularly vulnerable to bad advice and poor investment decisions. Without proper financial education and professional guidance, it's easy for athletes to make investment choices that seem promising but ultimately prove disastrous. The child support struggles mentioned in the research suggest that Rice, like several other players on this list, faced ongoing financial obligations that continued long after his playing career ended. These obligations can be particularly challenging to manage when other income sources are limited or unreliable. However, Rice's story includes a positive development that demonstrates the value of maintaining connections within the basketball community. He now serves as a scout and community ambassador for the Miami Heat, providing him with stable income and allowing him to remain connected to the sport that made him famous. Working as a scout represents a practical way for former players to use their basketball knowledge and experience to generate income. Scouting requires understanding player evaluation, game strategy, and team needs, all skills that successful former players possess. Unlike Rice's relatively conventional financial struggles with investments and obligations, our next story takes us into the realm of the truly extraordinary, where financial destruction meets cultural phenomenon in one of the most colorful careers in sports history. Dennis Rodman. Dennis Rodman was never just a basketball player. He was a cultural phenomenon whose bad boy persona made him one of the most recognizable athletes in the world. A Hall of Famer and 5-time NBA champion, Rodman's impact on basketball culture was immeasurable, but his approach to money was as unconventional and self-destructive as his approach to everything else in life. Rodman's career earnings totaled approximately $27 million, which might seem modest compared to some of the other players on this list, but was still substantial wealth that should have provided financial security. However, Rodman's relationship with money was as complicated as his relationship with authority, social norms, and personal responsibility. His bad boy persona fueled excessive partying, NBA fines, legal issues like child support and driving violations, and expensive assets, creating a lifestyle that consumed money at an alarming rate. Rodman didn't just spend money, he burned through it with the same intensity he brought to rebounding basketballs. The excessive partying wasn't just about having a good time, it was a lifestyle that included expensive venues, costly entourages, and the kind of spending that adds up quickly when you're trying to maintain a certain image. Rodman's parties were legendary, but they were also financially devastating. NBA fines might seem like a minor expense, but Rodman accumulated them at a rate that few players could match. Technical fouls, ejections, and other disciplinary actions resulted in a steady stream of financial penalties that added up over time. The legal issues, particularly child support and driving violations, created ongoing financial obligations and legal fees that continued long after his playing career ended. These weren't one-time expenses, but recurring costs that made it difficult to achieve financial stability. Rodman's expensive assets likely included luxury cars, jewelry, and other items that depreciated rapidly while requiring ongoing maintenance and insurance costs. These purchases provided immediate gratification but little long-term financial value. The combination of these factors led to financial collapse, forcing Rodman to confront the reality that his earning potential was finite while his expenses seemed unlimited. While Rodman's financial troubles were largely driven by his wild lifestyle and unconventional approach to money, our final story takes us back to a simpler time, when the financial challenges facing NBA players were often magnified by the era's lower salaries and limited financial resources. Sidney Moncrief. Sidney Moncrief's story represents a different category of financial struggle, one that occurred during an era when NBA salaries were significantly lower than today's standards. A Hall of Famer and five-time All-Star, Moncrief was one of the most skilled players of his generation, but his financial challenges illustrate how even successful players from earlier eras could find themselves vulnerable to economic setbacks. Moncrief's career earnings were approximately $15, $20 million, adjusted for era, which represented substantial wealth during the 1980s and early 1990s, but was still far less than what today's players earn. This lower earning potential made Moncrief particularly vulnerable to financial mistakes that modern players might be able to absorb. Despite a solid career, Moncrief faced bankruptcy due to bad business deals and investments post-retirement in the 1980s to 90s era of lower salaries, illustrating how the financial challenges facing former athletes aren't always about excessive spending but can stem from poor investment decisions and business ventures. The bad business deals mentioned in the research likely involved investments or business partnerships that seemed promising but ultimately failed. During the 1980s and 1990s, there were fewer resources available to help athletes make sound financial decisions, and many former players were targeted by unscrupulous individuals looking to take advantage of their wealth and naivety about business. The lower salary era context is crucial to understanding Moncrief's situation. While $15, $20 million was substantial wealth, it wasn't the kind of generational wealth that today's superstars can accumulate. This made Moncrief more vulnerable to financial setbacks and less able to recover from bad decisions. However, Moncrief's story demonstrates the importance of leveraging basketball knowledge and experience to create new career opportunities. He later became a coach and broadcaster, recovering financially, showing that skills developed during a playing career can be transformed into new sources of income. Thanks for watching. Check out other cards on the screen.